Dozens of Western hostages are reported killed in Algeria. It comes after another Western power attacks another Muslim country in the name of fighting terrorism. Well, what chance does France have in crushing Islamist militants in Mali? Hello and welcome to The World This Week with me, Phil Rees. Well, reports from Algeria, and as we speak, we can't confirm all of them. It says that perhaps 35 Western hostages and 15 kidnappers have been killed during a rescue attempt by the Algerian military after armed Islamists took over a gas plant in the east of the country. Well, the fighters say they seized the hostages in retaliation for Algeria allowing France to use its airspace to launch operations against rebels in northern Mali. The French government says its mission is to destroy al-Qaeda and other Islamist fighters who've taken over the northern half of Mali. Well, that'll be our first discussion today. In part two, turmoil in Pakistan. A charismatic preacher is camped outside the gates of Parliament with thousands of followers, demanding the overthrow of the government. More on that in 30 minutes. But we begin in the Sahel region of Africa. Now, last week, France took the lead in a mission previously dominated by the United States, sending troops to attempt to defeat jihadist forces that could threaten Western interests. Well, armed Islamist militants, some linked to al-Qaeda, had taken over the northern part of Mali. France has limited direct interest in Mali itself, but the West African country is geographically in the heart of France's former colonial empire, where it still has economic interests, including gas, uranium, gold mining, and others. Well, Fabien Martin now reports on France's lead role in yet another war on terror.
France, backed by the UK, Germany and US, has launched a military intervention in Mali. Islamist rebels have now seized the northern two-thirds of this country, which for decades has been one of the West Africa's most stable democracies, and French troops were welcomed by Mali's interim president.
Je voudrais vous apporter également les remerciements, la reconnaissance de l'ensemble du peuple malien.
But al-Qaeda's presence and now the rebel advancement has sparked fear that this country could soon become a base for terrorist attacks on Europe. French President Hollande said that they plan to deploy 2,500 more soldiers in its former colony to bolster the Malian army and work with the intervention force provided by West African states.
Vous demandez ce qu'on va faire des terroristes si on les retrouvait. Les détruire? Les faire prisonniers si c'est possible, et faire en sorte qu'ils ne puissent plus nuire à l'avenir. Nous sommes dans une opération qui n'est pas simplement de défendre une ligne, laquelle d'ailleurs, il n'y a pas de frontière à l'intérieur du Mali. Je vous l'ai dit, c'est d'arrêter l'agression, de permettre à Bamako d'être sécurisé pour que les autorités du Mali puissent être préservées et nos ressortissants.
But his warning appeared to have little impact as the tensions spread into neighbouring Algeria when Islamist militants attacked a gas facility in the east of the country yesterday. One Briton and one Algerian have been killed and more than 40 hostages have been taken captive. And reports earlier today claimed that dozens have now been killed, including several kidnappers in southern Algeria amid escalating violence. Exactly what is being demanded by the militants is contended, but it has been suggested that it is an act of vengeance against France's military intervention in Mali and against Algeria for allowing France to use its airspace. Algerian troops have surrounded the complex, and Foreign Secretary William Hague has condemned the attack. Hague is cautious to link these events to those in Mali.
I think we would be cautious about ascribing this at this stage to the French intervention in Mali.
Whether the French invasion was catalyst or cause of these events in Algeria, the situation is now critical, and many in Mali are calling for further aid.
Les troupes africaines seulement ne suffisent pas, il faut l'intervention de tout le monde, de tous les autres pays, y compris les Américains, y compris les autres Occidentaux qui sont réticents, qui ne veulent pas, qui ne s'arrêtent pas à apporter leur aide seulement, mais qui interviennent militairement aussi. Donc avec les problèmes algériens maintenant, tout le monde saura que ce qui se passe au Mali, c'est du sérieux.
Will fear of the spread of terror urge other countries to supply aid to Mali, turning this into a full-scale war? Or can there be hope of a swift resolution? Fabien Martin, Islam Channel.
Well, as we heard in Fabio's report there, that the kidnapping situation is unfolding as we speak, really, but we do know that there have been a lot of Western deaths, but we can't confirm all of that. Well, to discuss that, and indeed whether it is linked to Mali, I'm pleased to have in the studio James Schneider, the editor of Think Africa Press. We also have Luwezi Kinshasa, the Secretary General of the African Socialist International. And also we have the Africa specialist, Pietro Musilli. And finally on the phone, Professor Paul Rogers, the Professor of Peace Studies at the University of Bradford. Thank you all for joining us. Well, we heard in Fabio Martin's report there, William Hague saying that he must be cautious in attributing the kidnapping situation, which is at a gas plant, which was taken over by Islamic militants. This is in south, or at least eastern South Algeria, in the desert areas there. I mean, surely it is linked, isn't it? And isn't this, in fact, the kind of blowback that the French president was warning about, that when France takes action in Africa, then other people are going to, when you have an action, you have a violent reaction?
It probably is linked, and one of the hostage takers has told Mauritanian press that that is exactly why it's linked, and it is in retaliation for France's intervention. You are likely to have a response always when someone is attacked, and France has been prepared for this. They've sent troops to Bamako to support their French nationals who are there, and all across the region as well, where there's something like 30,000 French nationals who they are worried that there'll be further attacks against them.
What's your spin on this?
Yeah, definitely. It's the following French. If France didn't intervene, this probably would not have happened. And we have to tell the whole world that France has no business to do in Africa. But France has no legitimate right to go to Mali or anywhere else in Africa. It's up to the Africans to sort out all the problems we have in Africa. And should also point out what's happening basically in Africa, we can see now, is an effort by France and other imperialist countries to shift the crisis we see in Europe to Africa. That's basically the essence of what the French are trying to do. And we oppose
well,
that.
I mean, let's develop that thought later, perhaps. But I mean, in terms of just concentrating on the kidnapping now, just quickly, we'll sort of get that out the way. Then we'll discuss the broader issues taking place in Mali and what it means about the relation between the West and then Islamism, etc. But I mean, Pietro Musilli, would you say that Algeria is being dragged into this now because of its role, and it's obviously been a Western ally in the so-called war on terror from the very beginning?
I think that this episode shows one of the reasons why Algerians were cautious about joining in this, let's say, international alliance against the rebels in the north. For months, they've been hesitating to intervene, even with a simple action which would have been closing the border. We know that the north of Mali, the supply chain arrives through the Algerian borders. However, this has not been done.
These are desert areas, really, where even the border is hard to find for some people, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a desert area. It's very hard to control, but no one better than the Algerian army could do this job because they know the area. There is no foreign intervention force that could do this because as they are not used to this battlefield.
But I mean, in that sense, as France has already talked about increasing its own internal counter-terrorism efforts, I mean, what's the West and countries like Algeria allied to the West? What do you think they really want? I mean, why are they attacking other countries when they know that there'll be some kind of blowback?
I think France is concerned for the stability of the entire region. Probably some people might think they are looking at their investments in Mauritania and elsewhere. They are looking at the security of the French nationals. That the truth is that if France didn't intervene promptly, today we probably have Katiba, the rebel brigades at the doors of Bamako, because the Malian army is unprepared to tackle this crisis.
Okay, well, I mean, let's just bring in Paul Rogers, Professor Paul Rogers from University of Bradford. I mean, just on this question, though, of kind of blowback, we heard, of course, Britain suffered terribly in 7/7, but the person who was apparently leading that said that, it was a response to Britain's involvement in Iraq. Do you think that that's, that this is where the roots of what we call terrorism lie?
Well, it's certainly true that the Blair government was very keen to deny there was any connection between Iraq and the 7/7 bombings in London, but there clearly was a connection. And I think people tend to forget that there are connections of all sorts right across the Middle East through into South Asia, and what happens in one country can have an impact a long distance away. It's worth remembering what was happening with Mali. You had the rebels, Islamists, if you want to call them that, taking over a lot of the north of the country last year. And the original plan was to try and train the Mali army to bring in people from other African countries, aided by the French and others, and eventually repel the rebels up to the north. In fact, though, the rebels made such quick advances that the French went in very quickly. There's one important point. We're talking all the time about Islamist rebels. There's a very strong element in the centre and north of Mali, which is actually more nationalist, particularly in relation to the Tuareg people. And to see it purely as something which is Islamist, I think, is not seeing the full picture. And it, of course, complicates it hugely that it isn't just that, it is more than that. But nevertheless, the connections are there. And one has to say that if you get the pictures going right across the Middle East through into South Asia of the French jets taking off to do these bombing raids into northern Mali, people will make the connection with what happened in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and indeed even in Gaza. Whether you like it or not, that will be the connection made. And to that extent, I think we're dealing with something which can have much wider repercussions even than the events in Algeria over the last 48 hours, if indeed they're closely connected.
Well, I mean, just on that point, Paul, I mean, just talking about perhaps the nature of Mali, just to explain it to people, because it is a very divided country geographically, even ethnically, perhaps even to an extent in terms of religion, isn't it? In terms of the desert in the north and then the savannah in the south, where the capital Bamako is.
Yes, I mean, it's a country which is, about 5 times the size of the UK in area. It has about 15 million people overall. And the great majority of those are down in the south, along the banks of the Niger. Bamako is the capital and the surrounding towns. To the north, in what becomes savannah through, as you say, to desert, you have a much smaller population, and many of the people there are Tuareg, who for many years, right back to French colonial times, were fighting for a degree of independence. And this is why I'm saying that it isn't just Islamists coming in suddenly from outside and doing a takeover. It's more than that. And what it means is that if you do get a very strong reaction by military means rather than trying to get a negotiated settlement, people in the north of the country will react, and they will react strongly. It's certainly true that people in the south of Mali, in Bamako and elsewhere, are very much in favor of what the French are doing, and that is true from a number of other ECOWAS states. But that may be the case, but the reality is that this can readily be the start of something longer term. The French speak about a few weeks. I'll be surprised if they're not involved for 1, 2, or even more years, frankly.
I mean, well, Louise,
two things basically. The division of ethnic or cultural religious divisions in Mali is not that really important, because with unification of Africa, for economic development, all these people can come together. There could be a consolidation of African nation. So it's not really that important. And also, the second point, that there's a lot of support for French intervention. There has been a lot of misinformation, manipulation of the news. There is no way people in Africa can support the French invasion of Africa if they are told France is there for the gold, for the phosphate.
You see, of course, the nations of Africa as basically colonial entities that are unstable by their very formation, by the lines that were drawn, because, of course, Mali just was cut out of, in a sense, French West Africa.
The key thing is the economics. The key thing is the economics, and the borders have to go. If the economics and the borders are dealt with, people can definitely have an African economy, which we don't have. There is no such thing as African economy.
Okay, let's try and stick for the moment before. I mean, James, I mean, you're in favour of this. Do you think this invasion can really work? I mean, we've heard there from Paul Rogers and here that the fact that there are going to be endless problems. It'll be a long war. I mean, Western intervention in Muslim lands has not been a great success in recent years.
No, it hasn't. It's been an absolute disaster. I'm not necessarily in favour of it. I just don't think that it can be described as a neo-colonial action or another example necessarily of Western military forces.
Why is France doing it?
An invasion is an invasion, you know.
Well, why is France doing it then? I mean, are we in Britain under, or is someone in Paris under threat from?
No,
Al-Qaeda?
no, I don't think so. AQIM, and this is quite important when we're talking about the blowback in Algeria. AQIM is an Algerian group that has moved into Mali. This is not like it's the first time that Algeria has suffered from bombings or kidnappings and so on from this very group or groups that fall under the umbrella of AQIM. And AQIM have never attacked anywhere in mainland Europe. So that's not the primary reason. Of course, the reason why it's France that is doing this and is able to do it is, of course, because of the colonial legacy, of course, because of the colonial history.
And economic interests.
It's more than that.
Yes, they're economic interests, but I don't think that they should be massively overstated. There've been all these reports about the mineral-rich north of Mali, which really isn't the case. They've never found uranium there at the moment. The only uranium mine in Mali is in the far
Niger,
south.
there's a lot, though, isn't there?
Yes, there is.
Pietro?
I really agree with James. We shouldn't think too much about economic reason, especially if we are talking about Mali. What I would like to add, talking about the situation...
Well, why are they invading then? Just to help the people of Mali, in your view?
Definitely not. Definitely not.
Well, I mean, no. I mean, why?
They not help, but they have been requested.
No,
they were asked by the government.
They were asked by the government, and I think that France still have a huge interest in the area, in the region, entire region. As I said, you let Mali go, you will have a center of destabilization for the entire region. That's the problem for the French, I guess.
Yeah, and then why is France interested in the region again?
For their economic presence, I believe, and their interest.
I think we can draw a difference between whether France's presence in the region is legitimate or not, which you can very easily argue it's completely illegitimate and that their post-colonial legacy, whether that be military supporting dictators or in terms of control of economies, has been disgraceful. But that doesn't necessarily mean that this intervention is not called for and is not supported and was not asked for by the Malian government.
I disagree with that. The Malian government is illegitimate government. Everyone knows that African governments cannot solve and do not solve any problem for the people.
I mean, the government did come in on the back of a coup, didn't it? So it's not like France is defending a democratic government.
The government is there to maintain status quo, to maintain the place of Africa in the world economy, to produce raw material for Europe and America and Japan, other imperialist countries. So the government of Mali has no legitimacy to the people. That might be elected or not, it doesn't matter, because the economy is the starting point. We need an African economy. That's what we need.
I don't agree with that.
I know you will not agree, but
no,
we don't have...
Let me finish. Just because Americans, for instance, has been pushing for months to have election first, intervention after. The problem is that the reality of things, as we've seen in January, the acceleration events, didn't allow it. Because if you wait a few more months, you will have people, militias in Bamako.
Yeah, but do you think they want to attack Western soil, though? I mean, that's the point. Yeah.
At the moment, no, I don't think they would attack.
I think that's quite besides the point in terms of whether we think that it's either morally right or not morally right to intervene.
Okay, sorry, let me bring Paul Rogers in there. Sorry, Paul, what's your view on that?
Well, I mean, in terms of the motivations of the French, yes, technically they were invited in by the Bamako government. Yes, it results itself from a coup. It has a pretty poor human rights record. And it's also true that a number of West African states see a particular problem in northern Mali with groups that basically will not accept their rule. And by and large, I think the people who are most concerned are the Nigerians because of the extent of the Boko Haram revolt, particularly in the northeast of the country. If you put it all together, one has to say that a number of West African countries, Nigeria, Niger, Burkina Faso, and probably one or two others, would all be committed to aiding the Malian government as governments. Whether they are fully representative of their people in that is difficult to say. The French view very strongly is that if you have a large space in the center of West Africa, which is essentially under the control of a largely Islamist group, they do not find that acceptable for a whole range of reasons. There may be some economic, but many of them are security. The problem is that what has happened now is a sudden escalation with a heavy French involvement, and that really puts a completely new complexion on it, because it means that any possibility of getting any kind of negotiated way out is going to be very much more difficult. You can see why the French have done it, because of the the sudden inroads that the rebels made towards the south. But nevertheless, it means that we are sadly likely to see a much more long, drawn-out war than if this hadn't happened.
I mean, James Schneider, I mean, you mentioned earlier that Western involvement in Muslim lands has hardly had a good track record. Why should this be different? Or have we got what Paul Rogers has said, a long, drawn-out war?
I think we probably will have a long, drawn-out war, but again, that doesn't mean that what France did at this particular moment, which was to prevent the...
But will they succeed?
Well, it depends what your definition of success is and what sort of time frame you put on success. And now the main thing that is being done is bringing in the West African regional forces and trying to Africanize, if you will, this intervention and the attempt to push out these militant groups from the north of the country. So I think any idea that this could be over in a matter of weeks is completely foolhardy. But that in itself doesn't mean that it's necessarily a wrong thing to do.
But what will be the end game then, after all this time, in your view? I mean, come to you in a minute.
The end game for...
Well, what will be the result? What will, how do you see things unfolding?
It's going to be ugly. It's going to be ugly one way or the other, which is why when you said that I support it, I said I don't necessarily support it. We don't have enough facts to say one way or the other. There's going to be large effects of any intervention on internally displaced people in the north, on refugees, and also already last year there was large-scale drought and malnutrition which was taking place in the north of Mali, and this is obviously going to have a large effect on that.
Well,
we don't know yet until we see much more about the plans, which haven't really been formulated. It's all a bit ad hoc for now. What effects that's going to have, whether we can say that this is necessarily going to end up
But the
being
omens
judged
don't
as a
look
good or
good,
a
do they?
bad
Malnutrition, amnesty, international warning to increase the scale of human rights violations. It's hard to see the plus side, isn't it? I mean, Louise?
Yeah, this is imperialism. That's the legacy of French imperialism. But just a couple of things, basically. One is the French imperialism and the U.S. imperialism, they all need alchemy, so they can define imperialism, or they can hide imperialism by using war on terror, because the problem in Africa is imperialism, no war on terror. War on terror is what imperialism telling us the problem is, but that's not really the main issue we have. And secondly, we're not saying anything about the U.S. being in Mali for almost 10 years, training the Malian army, doing what? And there is that too.
They trained the people who staged the coup, didn't they, indeed?
Yeah, exactly.
So, all right, listen, we're coming to then, Louise. I'm sorry, I just want to bring in Pietro there. I mean, in a way, any Western government that wants to bomb a Muslim country now just says, they're a bunch of terrorists and goes ahead and does it. I mean, is that how you see this?
No, they're not a bunch of terrorists. There are some people strongly ideologically affiliated to Al-Qaeda or other jihadist groups, but I agree with Dr. Rogers that we have the biggest component is formed by Tuareg. They started. We're talking about people that have been waging war at the Malian government since 1990. Yad Agali, the leader of Ansar Din, is someone that has been signing, I think, 5 or 6 peace treaties up now, and probably
So there's certainly an overlap with the Islamists, and you'd say the Tuareg sentiments, even though they have sort of not been partners in recent months.
The difference now is different because they embrace the Islamist cause to bring on the nationalist or regional cause.
Yeah, sure. Well, listen, I'm afraid, gentlemen, we've run out of time. I'm sorry. I'm afraid we're coming out of time. It's fascinating, a complex thing, and something we should all keep our eyes on, indeed, in the coming days and weeks. And I'm sure we will be seeing a lot more about this story. Thanks to all our guests. In part 2, Pakistan's government is besieged on multiple fronts just a few months ahead of elections. Have the Pakistan public simply had enough? More in a few minutes. Stay with us.